If you enjoy my stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Leave a comment telling me which city you're from and what time it is there. I'm curious to know where my favorite subscribers are from, and share the scariest story that ever happened to you. I'll pin the best one under the video forever. My name is Jake Morrison, and I need to tell you about what happened at Blackwood State Park during the last weekend of August 2024. Not because I expect you to believe me. Hell, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it, but because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand why 3 teenagers are still missing, why the Park Service has quietly cordoned off a section of the forest, and why you should never, ever make a fire in those woods after dark. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. 6 of us from Jefferson High, celebrating the end of summer before our senior year started. We'd been planning it for months. Dan Kowalski, my best friend since elementary school. Sarah Chen, who'd been dating Dan for the past year. Marcus Williams, the kind of guy who could make friends with a brick wall. Amy Foster, quiet and bookish, but always game for adventure. And Tyler Brooks, the class clown who somehow managed to be funny without being annoying. And me, Jake Morrison, the one who suggested Blackwood in the first place. God, I wish I'd picked anywhere else. Blackwood State Park sits in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania, about 3 hours from Philadelphia. It's one of those places that feels like it hasn't changed in 100 years. Thick forests of oak and pine, rocky streams that run clear and cold, and hiking trails that wind through valleys where the morning mist hangs like ghosts among the trees. The Park Service maintains a few basic campgrounds, but we'd gotten permission to use one of the primitive sites deeper in the forest, away from the RV crowds and screaming kids. It should have been perfect. We arrived Friday afternoon, late August heat still clinging to the air, despite the calendar saying autumn was just around the corner. The campsite was exactly what we'd hoped for, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a fire ring made of blackened stones and enough flat ground for our tents. A stream gurgled somewhere in the distance, and the only sounds were bird calls and the whisper of wind through the branches. "This is incredible," Sarah said, dropping her backpack and spinning in a slow circle to take in the view. "It's like we're the only people in the world." Dan grinned and pulled her close. "That's the idea. No parents, no teachers, no little kids asking if we've seen their lost frisbee." "No cell service either," Marcus added, holding up his phone and frowning at the display. "I've got 0 bars." "Good," Amy said, already unpacking her camera equipment. "Sometimes it's nice to be disconnected." Tyler was poking around the fire ring with a stick. "Looks like someone had a good time here recently. This wood's only been cold for a day or 2. I felt a slight chill, though I couldn't say why. Park Service probably burns the accumulated brush every so often, keeps the forest healthy. We spent the rest of the afternoon setting up Camp 6 tents arranged in a rough semicircle around the fire ring, with the opening facing toward the trail we'd hiked in on. Dan and I gathered firewood while the others organized our food supplies and sleeping gear. By the time the sun started sinking behind the trees, we had a respectable pile of dry branches and logs ready to burn. The fire caught easily, crackling to life, with that particular smell of burning pine and oak that always reminds me of summer camp and simpler times. We roasted hot dogs on sharpened sticks, shared bags of chips and trail mix, and passed around bottles of water that tasted faintly of chlorine tablets. As darkness settled over the forest, the conversation turned to the usual senior year topics: college applications, weekend parties, who was dating whom. It was Marcus who first mentioned hearing something in the woods. "You guys hear that?" he said, pausing mid-sentence in his story about his summer job at the movie theater. We all stopped talking and listened. For a moment, there was nothing but the normal forest sounds: wind in the branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft crackle of our fire. Then, just at the edge of hearing, came a different sound. Footsteps, maybe, or something brushing against the undergrowth. "Probably just a deer," Dan said, "or a raccoon. Woods are full of animals." "Sounded bigger than a raccoon," Tyler said, but he was smiling as he said it. "Maybe it's Bigfoot." "Don't even joke about that," Amy said, though she was smiling too. "My cousin swears he saw something weird in these woods when he was a kid." "Yeah? Like what?" "Just something that wasn't quite right. He said it looked like a person from a distance, but when it got closer..." She shrugged. "Probably just his imagination. He was only 8. We went back to our conversation, but I found myself glancing toward the trees more often, trying to pierce the wall of darkness that surrounded our little circle of firelight. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind, creating shapes that looked almost like figures before dissolving back into random patterns. It was around 10:30 when Dan saw them. He'd been in the middle of telling a story about his summer job at the marina when he suddenly stopped talking, his eyes fixed on something beyond the fire. The rest of us followed his gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw what had caught his attention. Children. 3 of them, standing just at the edge of the firelight. They looked to be maybe 10 or 11 years old, dressed in clothes that seemed old-fashioned, simple cotton shirts and pants that looked handmade. They were barefoot, and their skin was pale, almost luminous in the flickering light. But it was their eyes that made my breath catch in my throat. They were completely white. No irises, no pupils. Just blank white orbs that reflected the firelight like polished marble. "Holy shit," Tyler whispered. "Where did they come from?" The children didn't respond. They just stood there, perfectly still, watching us with those terrible blank eyes. One of them, a girl with long dark hair, tilted her head slightly like she was listening to something we couldn't hear. "Hey," Sarah called out, her voice carefully friendly. "Are you guys okay? Are you lost?" Still no response. The children remained motionless for another few seconds, then turned and melted back into the forest as silently as they'd appeared. "Well, that was creepy as hell," Marcus said, trying to inject some humor into his voice. "Anyone else getting serious Village of the Damn vibes?" "They're probably from another campsite," Dan said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Maybe their parents are letting them explore." "At this time of night?" Amy shook her head. "And did you see their eyes? Something was definitely wrong with them?" "Could be albino," I suggested, though the explanation felt weak even as I said it. "Some kind of genetic condition." "All 3 of them?" Tyler raised an eyebrow. "What are the odds?" We debated it for another few minutes, but eventually the conversation moved on to other topics. Still, I noticed that we all kept glancing toward the trees, and when someone suggested adding more wood to the fire, nobody objected, even though it was already burning brightly. Around midnight, we started talking about turning in for the night. Sarah and Amy had already retreated to their tents, claiming they wanted to get some sleep before tomorrow's planned hike to the waterfall. Tyler was telling increasingly elaborate ghost stories, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper whenever he reached the scary parts. That's when they came back. One moment, we were alone around the fire, listening to Tyler describe some supposedly true encounter with a phantom hitchhiker. The next moment, there were children sitting among us, not 3 this time. 5 of them, spaced around the fire ring, like they'd always been there. They sat with their legs crossed, hands folded in their laps, staring into the flames with those blank white eyes. They were perfectly silent, perfectly still, but somehow their presence changed everything. The temperature seemed to drop, and the very air felt heavy, oppressive. "Jesus Christ," Dan breathed. "Where did you come from?" The children didn't acknowledge the question. They just continued staring into the fire, their faces expressionless. Up close, I could see more details that made my skin crawl. Their skin wasn't just pale. It was translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. Their hair hung limp and lifeless, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. And their clothes, which had looked merely old-fashioned from a distance, were actually torn and stained with what looked like mud or something worse. "This isn't normal," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "Kids don't just appear like that." "Maybe they're sleepwalking," Tyler suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. One of the children, a boy with sandy hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for those terrible eyes, turned his head toward Tyler. For a moment, I thought he was going to speak. Instead, he opened his mouth and made a sound that was somewhere between a whisper and a hiss. "Sleep. Walking," he repeated. But the words came out wrong, distorted, like they were being played back on a broken tape recorder. The other children began to echo him, their voices creating a disturbing harmony. "Sleep. Walking. Walking. Walking." "That's enough," Dan said, standing up abruptly. "I don't know what kind of game you kids are playing, but you need to go back to your parents. Now." The children fell silent, but they didn't move. They just continued staring into the fire, their faces blank and emotionless. The boy who had spoken turned his attention back to the flames, and I could swear I saw his mouth curve upward in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "I'm going to find a park ranger," Marcus announced, backing away from the fire. "This is seriously messed up." "Good idea," I said. "Dan and I will stay here with them until you get back." Marcus nodded and disappeared into the darkness, following the trail that led back toward the main campground. We could hear his footsteps for a few minutes, then nothing but the usual forest sounds and the soft crackle of burning wood. The children remained motionless. Minutes passed. 10, then 15, then 20. Tyler kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath about how long it was taking Marcus to find help. Dan tried a few more times to communicate with the children, asking them their names, where they lived, whether they needed help. They ignored him completely. It was around 1 a.m. when I first noticed the changes. The girl with the long dark hair, I'd been watching her more closely than the others because she seemed to be the unofficial leader, was beginning to look different. Her face, which had been pale but essentially normal, was starting to shift. Her cheekbones were becoming more pronounced, her jaw more angular. Her mouth, which had been a normal size, was slowly stretching wider. "Dan," I whispered, trying not to alarm the children, "look at the girl. Really look at her." Dan followed my gaze, and I saw his face go white. What the hell? The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. As we watched, the girl's features continued to change. Her ears began to migrate backward toward the sides of her head. Her nose flattened against her face. And her mouth, God, her mouth kept getting wider, stretching until it reached almost from ear to ear. The other children were changing too. The boy who had spoken earlier was developing additional joints in his arms and legs, making his limbs bend in ways that human limbs shouldn't. Another child's eyes were sinking deeper into his skull, while his forehead bulged outward like a caveman's. "We need to get out of here," Dan said, his voice barely audible. "Right now." But as he started to stand, the girl's head snapped toward him with mechanical precision. Her mouth opened, revealing teeth that were far too numerous and far too sharp for any human child. When she spoke, her voice was like grinding glass. "Sit down." It wasn't a request. There was something in her tone, some quality that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive part of the brain that understood predators and prey. Dan's legs buckled, and he collapsed back into his seat as if he'd been pushed. Tyler tried to run. He made it maybe 3 steps before one of the children, a boy whose limbs had elongated to spider-like proportions, scuttled across the ground with impossible speed and grabbed Tyler's ankle. Tyler screamed and fell face first into the dirt, then screamed again as the thing's fingers made contact with his skin. Where the creature touched him, Tyler's flesh began to blacken and blister, as if he was being burned by invisible fire. The smell hit us a second later, charred meat and something else, something chemical and wrong. "Let him go," Dan shouted, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and swinging it at the creature. The improvised weapon passed right through the thing's body as if it wasn't there, but the movement seemed to startle it. It released Tyler's ankle and scuttled back to its position by the fire. Tyler rolled onto his back, gasping and clutching his injured leg. The skin around his ankle was black and cracked, with deep fissures that wept a fluid that didn't look like blood. His eyes were wide with shock and pain. "My leg," he whispered. "I can't feel my leg." Dan and I dragged him away from the fire ring toward the tents. The children watched us with those blank white eyes, but they didn't interfere. They just sat there, perfectly still, while Tyler writhed in agony and the blackened flesh began to spread up his calf. "We have to get him to a hospital," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was pointless. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and Tyler's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The blackness was now creeping up his thigh, and his breathing was becoming shallow and labored. "The hunting cabin," Dan said suddenly. "Remember? We passed it on the way in. Maybe there's a radio or a landline." The cabin was about a mile deeper into the forest, accessible by an old logging road that branched off from the main trail. It was maintained by the Park Service for researchers and emergency personnel. And Dan was right. It might have communication equipment. But leaving meant abandoning Tyler. who was clearly in no condition to travel. And it meant leaving him alone with those things. "I'll go," I said. "You stay with Tyler and try to keep him stable." "Like hell. I'm not letting you go out there alone. One of us has to." "No one goes." The voice came from directly behind us. We spun around to find the children standing in a semicircle blocking the path to the trail. They were no longer sitting by the fire. They were upright, and I could see how much they'd changed. Their proportions were all wrong now, with elongated limbs and twisted spines that made them look like broken marionettes. Their faces had become barely recognizable as human, with features that shifted and flowed like melting wax. But worst of all were their mouths. All 5 of them were smiling now, their lips stretched impossibly wide to reveal rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. When they breathed, the sound was like steam escaping from a radiator. "Stay, sit, watch," the girl said, her voice now a harmonious blend of child and something much older and more predatory. "Fire. Pretty. Warm." As if drawn by her words, the flames in the fire ring suddenly flared higher, sending shadows dancing across the clearing. The children began to move in a slow circle around the fire, their movements jerky and unnatural. Like a movie being played at the wrong speed, Tyler's breathing had become so shallow it was barely audible. The blackness had spread to his chest, and his skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. I could see his heart beating beneath his ribs, each pulse weaker than the last. "He's dying," I whispered to Dan. "I know. We have to do something." But what could we do? The children had made it clear that we weren't allowed to leave, and Tyler was beyond any help we could provide. The best we could do was make him comfortable and hope that Marcus would return with help soon. Except I was beginning to doubt that Marcus was coming back at all. The children continued their slow dance around the fire, occasionally stopping to stare at one of us with those terrible blank eyes. They whispered to each other in a language that sounded like static and broken glass, their voices rising and falling in an alien rhythm that made my teeth ache. As the night wore on, more children appeared. They emerged from the forest in ones and twos, drawn by the firelight like moths. Some looked almost normal, aside from their pale skin and white eyes. Others were clearly well into their transformation, with limbs that bent wrong and faces that belonged in nightmares. By 3 a.m, there were at least a dozen of them surrounding our campsite, and they were all watching us. "This is insane," Dan muttered. He was sitting cross-legged next to Tyler, trying to offer what comfort he could to his dying friend. "Where are they coming from? How are there so many of them?" I didn't have an answer. The logical part of my brain was still trying to find rational explanations. Maybe they were kids from a nearby town playing some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe they were suffering from some kind of mass hysteria or shared delusion. Maybe we were the ones having the breakdown, and none of this was really happening. But Tyler's burned leg was real. The smell of charred flesh was real. And the way those things moved, the way they looked at us like we were nothing more than interesting specimens in a jar, that was real too. Around 4 a.m, Tyler stopped breathing. The blackness had spread throughout his entire body by then, turning his skin the color of old leather and creating deep fissures that revealed something that wasn't quite muscle and bone. His final breath escaped as a soft sigh, and then he was still. The children stopped their dance immediately, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. They turned toward Tyler's body with unmistakable hunger in those white eyes, and several of them began to approach with slow, deliberate steps. "Stay back!" Dan shouted, grabbing another burning branch from the fire. "Don't you touch him!" The children paused, cocking their heads in unison, like birds trying to understand a strange sound. Then the girl with the dark hair laughed, a sound like breaking crystal that made my spine crawl. "Touch him," she repeated in that distorted voice. "Yeah, touch." Before Dan could react, she darted forward with inhuman speed and placed her hand on Tyler's forehead. Where her fingers made contact, Tyler's flesh began to crumble, disintegrating into a fine gray dust that scattered in the night breeze. Within seconds, there was nothing left of Tyler Brooks but a pile of ash and the lingering smell of burnt meat. Dan screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the forest. He swung the burning branch at the girl, but again it passed harmlessly through her body. She smiled, wider, revealing even more rows of those horrible teeth. "Warm," she said, looking directly at me. "Fire. Warm. Warm." That's when I realized we weren't going to survive until dawn. Whatever these things were, they weren't just playing with us anymore. They were ready to feed. "The cabin," I whispered to Dan. "We have to try for the cabin." He nodded, still staring at the spot where Tyler had died. On three. On three. We counted down silently, meeting each other's eyes. Then, as one, we bolted for the tree line. The children shrieked behind us, a sound like a dozen smoke alarms going off at once. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush in pursuit, moving faster than anything human should be able to move. But we had a head start, and we knew where we were going. The logging road was barely visible in the darkness, just two parallel ruts, overgrown with weeds and small saplings. We ran down it as fast as we dared, guided more by memory than sight, our breathing harsh and ragged in the still air behind us. The shrieks were getting closer. "There!" Dan gasped, pointing ahead. Through the trees I could see the outline of the hunting cabin, a small wooden structure built on stilts to keep it off the marshy ground. A set of rough stairs led up to a narrow porch, and I could see the glint of windows reflecting starlight. We reached the base of the stairs just as the first of the children burst out of the forest behind us. It was the boy with the spider-like limbs, and he was moving on all fours now, his elongated fingers digging furrows in the soft earth. His mouth was open, revealing a throat that went down much deeper than any human throat. I grabbed Dan's arm and hauled him up the stairs. The cabin door was locked, but it was old wood, and the lock was just a simple deadbolt. Dan threw his shoulder against it, and on the third try, the frame splintered and the door burst open. We tumbled inside and slammed the door behind us, shooting the deadbolt and wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. The cabin was dark and smelled of dust and mouse droppings, but it felt like a fortress compared to the open forest. "Radio," Dan said, fumbling around in the darkness. "There has to be a radio." I found a battery-powered lantern on a shelf near the door and clicked it on. The pale light revealed a single room with basic furnishings, a fold-out cot, a small table and chairs, shelves lined with emergency supplies. And there, on a table in the corner, was exactly what we'd hoped to find. A two-way radio with a stubby antenna and a coiled cord. Dan grabbed the handset and started pressing buttons. Emergency! Emergency! This is... Damn! What's our location? He looked around frantically for some kind of identification. This is the hunting cabin in Sector 7 of Blackwood State Park. We have multiple casualties and need immediate assistance. Static answered him. He tried adjusting the frequency, tried different channels, but got nothing but white noise. It's not working, he said, his voice cracking with desperation. The battery's dead, or the antenna's damaged, or... Thump. Something hit the side of the cabin, hard enough to make the whole structure shake. Then another impact, and another. Whatever was outside, there was more than one of them, and they were trying to break in. Thump. 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 The windows, I said, pointing to the two small windows on opposite walls. They were covered with heavy shutters, but I could see cracks of light around the edges, where the wood didn't quite meet. As if reading my thoughts, one of the shutters exploded inward in a shower of splinters and broken glass. A pale arm reached through the opening, fingers groping blindly for the latch on the inside. The hand had too many joints, and the fingers ended in what looked like broken fingernails that had grown into claws. Dan grabbed a poker from beside the wood stove and brought it down on the arm with all his strength. There was a wet sound like crushing fruit, and the arm jerked back through the window, but seconds later it returned, apparently undamaged. Thump, thump, thump. The impacts were getting stronger, more coordinated. Whatever was outside had figured out that brute force wasn't going to work, and they were trying a more systematic approach. I could hear them moving around the cabin, testing different points of entry, looking for weaknesses. They're going to get in, Dan said. He was standing in the center of the room, poker raised, turning in slow circles to keep track of all the potential entry points. It's just a matter of time. He was right. The cabin was sturdy, but it wasn't designed to withstand a siege. The walls were simple wood siding over a frame, and the windows were just single-pane glass with basic shutters. Given enough time and determination, the children would find a way inside. The attacks stopped suddenly, leaving us in an eerie silence, broken only by our own ragged breathing. For a few minutes, we stood there waiting for the next assault, but nothing happened. Maybe they gave up, Dan whispered. No, I said, though I wasn't sure why I was so certain. They're still out there. They're just thinking. As if to prove my point, I heard a new sound from above our heads, the soft scrabble of claws on wood. Something was on the roof. We both looked up at the ceiling, following the sound as it moved from one end of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped, directly above the center of the room. The roof access, Dan said, pointing to a square panel in the ceiling that I hadn't noticed before. It was probably meant for maintenance, or as an emergency exit in case of flooding. They found it. The panel began to shake as something worked at it from above. Dust rained down, and I could see the edges starting to separate from the ceiling. Dan and I grabbed the heaviest pieces of furniture we could find, the table, the chairs, a small bookshelf, and piled them under the access panel. It wouldn't stop them for long, but it might slow them down. The panel fell away with a crash, landing on our improvised barricade. A pale face appeared in the opening, upside down, with those terrible white eyes and that too wide mouth. It was one of the children from the campfire, though It had changed so much I could barely recognize it as having once been human. "Hello," it said in that distorted voice. "We play now." It began to squeeze through the opening, its body contorting in ways that should have been impossible, its limbs folded and twisted, compressing its mass until it could fit through a space barely 2 feet square. Dan swung the poker at its head, connecting with a solid thunk. The creature's skull caved in on one side, but it kept coming, apparently unfazed by the injury. Black fluid leaked from the wound, but it wasn't blood. It was too thick, too dark, and it moved with a life of its own. I grabbed the lantern and hurled it at the thing. The plastic casing shattered, and battery acid splashed across its face and torso. This time, it reacted, letting out that steam hiss sound and pulling back slightly, but the acid didn't seem to be burning it so much as annoying it. The creature finished squeezing through the opening and dropped to the floor with a wet thud up close. I could see just how thoroughly it had transformed. Its skin was now completely translucent, revealing a network of black veins that pulsed with some alien circulation. Its face had lost all human proportions, with eyes that had sunken so deep they were barely visible, and a mouth that split its head almost in half. But most disturbing of all were its movements. It didn't walk or crawl like any earthly creature. Instead, it flowed across the floor like liquid mercury, its limbs bending and reshaping themselves as needed. When it wanted to change direction, it simply reformed its body to face the new heading. And it was fast, terrifyingly fast. Dan barely had time to raise the poker before the thing was on him, its elongated fingers wrapping around his throat. Where they touched, his skin began to blacken and blister, just like Tyler's had. Dan screamed and tried to fight it off, but the creature's grip was inhuman in its strength. I looked around desperately for a weapon, anything that might be more effective than the broken lantern. My eyes fell on a propane camping stove sitting on one of the shelves, connected to a small tank by a rubber hose fire. Tyler had said the camp's previous fire was only a day or two old. These things were drawn to heat, to flame. Maybe. I grabbed the stove and twisted the valve on the propane tank all the way open. Gas began hissing out of the burner, filling the small cabin with the distinctive smell of mercaptan. I didn't have a lighter, but there were matches in the emergency supplies. "Dan, get down," I shouted. He was beyond hearing me. The creature's touch had spread up his neck and across his face, and his struggles were becoming weaker. But when I struck the match, the flare of light seemed to distract the thing. It turned toward me, loosening its grip just enough for Dan to break free. I tossed the lit match toward the stove. The explosion was smaller than I'd hoped, but bigger than I'd feared. The propane ignited in a blue-white fireball that filled half the cabin, and the creature caught in the blast simply ceased. It didn't burn or disintegrate. It just vanished, as if it had never existed at all. But the cabin was now on fire, and we could hear more of them moving on the roof above. "Window!" Dan gasped, his voice hoarse and damaged. Half his face was black with that spreading corruption, but he was still mobile. "Back window!" We kicked out the remaining glass and shutters and tumbled through the opening, landing hard on the marshy ground behind the cabin. The fire was spreading quickly. The old wood was dry, and the propane had splashed burning fuel across multiple surfaces, but at least it was light. The flames cast a wide circle of illumination around the cabin, and within that circle we could see them clearly for the first time. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They surrounded the burning building in concentric circles, their pale forms just visible at the edge of the firelight. Some still looked vaguely human, while others had transformed into shapes that belonged in the deepest nightmares. All of them had those same white eyes. All of them wore that same terrible smile. And all of them were watching us. The ones closest to the fire kept their distance, apparently unable to approach the flames directly. But the outer rings were moving, flowing around the cabin like water around a stone, looking for gaps in the light where they could close in. "The fire won't last long," Dan said. He was leaning heavily against me, and I could see the blackness spreading from his neck down toward his chest. "When it burns out." "It won't burn out," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Someone will see the smoke. The Park Service will come to investigate." In the middle of the night, in this remote area? Dan shook his head. "We're on our own." The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet into the air and sending sparks cascading into the surrounding trees. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, but it was the only thing keeping those creatures at bay. As we watched, some of the more transformed children began to test the boundaries of the light, darting forward in quick rushes before retreating to safety. Each time they got a little closer, stayed a little longer. They were learning, adapting, finding the limits of what they could endure. "Look," Dan whispered, pointing upward. High above the burning cabin, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, more shapes were moving. They clung to the tops of the tall pines like oversized insects, watching the fire with those alien eyes. Some of them were calling to each other in that static glass language, coordinating their efforts. "They're everywhere," I said. "The whole forest is full of them." Dan nodded weakly. The corruption had reached his chest now, and his breathing was becoming labored. "Jake, I need you to promise me something. Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." "No, I'm not. Look at me." He held up his hands, and I could see the blackness creeping down his arms toward his fingers. Tyler lasted maybe an hour after he was touched. I've got less than that. "Dan, promise me you'll get out of here. Tell people what happened. Don't let them cover this up." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him we'd find a way to save him, but the evidence was right there in front of me. Tyler was gone. Marcus was probably dead. Sarah and Amy had disappeared from their tents hours ago, and Dan was dying by inches, consumed by whatever alien force powered those creatures. "I promise," I said. The cabin's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris, and for a moment the entire clearing was bright as day. In that stark illumination, I could see the true scope of what we were facing. The creatures weren't just surrounding us. They filled the forest as far as the eye could see, packed so densely among the trees that they looked like a pale carpet covering the forest floor. But I also saw something else, a gap in their ranks, maybe 20 feet wide, leading toward the old logging road. The creatures there were younger looking, less transformed, and they seemed less confident about approaching the firelight. "There," I pointed. "There's an opening." Dan followed my gaze and nodded. "You have to run. Now, while the fire's still bright. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice." He was struggling to speak now, each word an effort. I can't run anymore, but you can make it. You're fast, and you know where you're going. He was right, and we both knew it. The corruption had spread through most of his body, and he could barely stand. Taking him with me would doom us both. But leaving him felt like the worst kind of betrayal. "They'll come for you as soon as I'm gone," I said. "I know." Dan managed a weak smile. "But maybe I can buy you some time. Create a distraction." He picked up a piece of burning debris from the collapsed cabin and held it like a torch. The creatures nearest to him hissed and backed away, but they didn't retreat far. They were waiting for the fire to burn down, for his strength to fail. "Go," he said. "Run. Don't look back." I hesitated for one more second, memorizing his face. Then I turned and sprinted toward the gap in the creatures' ranks. They saw me coming, of course. The ones guarding the logging road began to move to intercept me, their forms flowing and shifting as they prepared to attack. But they were still wary of the firelight, still reluctant to get too close to the burning cabin. I made it maybe 10 feet before the first one reached me. It was a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 when she'd been whatever these things were. Her face was still mostly human, but her arms had elongated and her fingers had fused into blade-like appendages. She swiped at me as I passed, and I felt her claws tear through my jacket, but I kept running, and she stumbled, trying to turn and follow. The gap was right ahead, just a few more steps. Behind me, I heard Dan scream. I risked a glance back and saw him surrounded by a dozen of the creatures. He was swinging his makeshift torch in wide arcs, trying to keep them at bay, but there were too many of them. As I watched, one of them darted in and grabbed his arm, and he went down under a pile of pale, writhing bodies. The scream cut off abruptly. I reached the logging road and kept running, tears streaming down my face. The creatures followed for a while, but they seemed reluctant to venture too far from the fire. After a few hundred yards, they gave up the chase and faded back into the forest, but I could still hear them behind me, calling to each other in that alien language, coordinating their search patterns. They knew I was out here somewhere, and they weren't going to give up easily. I ran for what felt like hours, following the old road as it wound through the forest toward the main park entrance. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding one of those pale forms. But I kept moving, driven by the promise I'd made to Dan and the growing hope that I might actually make it out alive. The first light of dawn was starting to filter through the trees when I finally reached the park boundary. The sight of the ranger station, with its electric lights and normal human proportions, was almost enough to make me collapse with relief. But when I staggered through the front door and tried to tell the duty ranger what had happened, I ran into a problem I hadn't anticipated. Nobody believed me. "Slow down, son," the ranger said, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the patient expression of someone who'd dealt with his share of overwrought campers. "You're saying your friends were attacked by children?" "Not children. Things that looked like children, but they weren't human. They were..." I struggled to find words that didn't sound insane. "Something else. Something wrong." The ranger looked at me with growing concern, probably wondering if I was having some kind of psychotic break. "When did you last eat or sleep? Sometimes exhaustion and dehydration can cause hallucinations. This wasn't a hallucination. My friends are dead. Tyler Brooks, Dan Kowalski, Marcus Williams, they're all dead. All right. Let's just calm down and take this one step at a time. He picked up his radio and called for backup, both additional rangers and paramedics, to check me over. You said you were camping in Sector 7? Yes, the primitive site near Kettle Creek. And you're sure your friends didn't just leave? Maybe get spooked and decide to hike out during the night? They didn't leave. I could hear my voice getting shrill, but I couldn't help it. They were killed by those things. Burned alive. You have to send someone out there. The ranger nodded diplomatically and made notes on a clipboard, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was crazy. Over the next hour, as more officials arrived and I told my story over and over again, that look became more pronounced. The Park Service did send a team to investigate, of course. They found the burned remains of the hunting cabin and the destroyed campsite, exactly as I'd described. But they found no bodies, no evidence of any children or other campers in the area, and no signs of violence beyond what might be explained by a camping accident. Their official report concluded that my friends had probably been caught in a fast-moving forest fire, possibly started by an unattended campfire, and that the trauma of watching them burn had caused me to hallucinate the attackers. The fact that no remains were found was explained by the intensity of the blaze, which had burned hot enough to completely consume organic matter. It was a neat, rational explanation that accounted for all the physical evidence. And it was complete bullshit. But nobody wanted to hear about pale children with white eyes and impossible smiles. Nobody wanted to consider the possibility that something alien and hostile was living in the deep woods of Blackwood State Park. It was easier to believe that a teenager had suffered a psychotic break than to accept that the natural world contained horrors beyond human understanding. The Park Service quietly cordoned off the area around Kettle Creek, citing ongoing ecological restoration efforts. No new camping permits were issued for that section of the forest. And gradually, people stopped asking questions about what had really happened to those 5 teenagers who'd gone camping and never come home. But I knew the truth. And 3 months later, when I finally worked up the courage to go back, I found proof. It was winter by then, the forest blanketed in snow and seemingly empty of life. I hiked in along the old logging road, following the same path Dan and I had taken during our desperate flight from the cabin. The burned clearing was still there, though new growth was already starting to reclaim the scorched earth. And there, half buried in the ash and debris, I found what I'd been looking for, a pile of small bones and tiny teeth, blackened by fire but unmistakably human, children's bones. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered around what had once been the fire ring. But these weren't the bones of victims. They were too old, too weathered, some of them showing signs of being gnawed or deliberately broken. These were the bones of the creatures themselves, or what they'd once been before their transformation. The remains of children who'd been taken or lured into the forest over decades, maybe centuries, and changed into something else, something hungry. I gathered as much evidence as I could and took it to the authorities, but they dismissed it as animal bones scattered by scavengers. When I insisted on independent analysis, they suggested I might benefit from continued psychiatric evaluation, So I stopped trying to convince them, but I also stopped being silent. I started a blog, posted videos, shared my story on every platform I could find. Most people dismissed me as another internet crazy, but a few listened, a few believed. And slowly, very slowly, other stories started to emerge. Stories about children seen in forests across the country, always near campgrounds, always appearing after dark. Stories about camping trips that went wrong, about people who vanished without a trace, about things that looked human but moved wrong and smiled too wide. The Park Service continues to deny that anything unusual happened at Blackwood. They point to their safety record, their scientific studies, their carefully maintained statistics. But if you look closely at those statistics, you'll notice something interesting. The number of unexplained disappearances in heavily forested areas has been steadily increasing over the past few decades. And it's not just adults who vanish. Children go missing too, often during family camping trips or school outings. The official explanations vary. They got lost. They fell into rivers. They were taken by wild animals or human predators. But sometimes, if you read between the lines of the incident reports, you'll find details that don't quite fit those explanations. Witnesses who report seeing the missing child after the search began, but something was wrong with their appearance. Campsites found undisturbed except for circles of ash around the fire rings. Electronic equipment that malfunctions for no apparent reason. And always, the suggestion that those who report such details might be suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. I know better. I know what's really happening in those forests. And I know why the authorities work so hard to suppress the truth. Because there's nothing they can do about it. No way to fight an enemy that can appear human one moment and become something else the next. No way to protect people from a threat that officially doesn't exist. So they contain the stories instead. They discredit the witnesses, classify the evidence, and file the reports in databases that will never see public scrutiny. And meanwhile, the disappearances continue. It's been 2 years now since that night at Blackwood State Park. I still wake up sometimes with the smell of burning flesh in my nostrils and the sound of Dan's final scream echoing in my ears. I still see those pale faces in the shadows at the edge of campfires. Still hear that static glass language in the whisper of wind through trees. But I also remember the promise I made to Dan, and I keep looking for ways to honor it. I keep telling the story, keep warning people, keep hoping that someday someone with real authority will listen and take action. Because those things are still out there, still hunting, still transforming lost children into pale shadows of their former selves and using them to lure new victims into the darkness. And if you ever find yourself camping in a remote forest, if you ever see children sitting by your fire who weren't there before, if they have white eyes and they whisper in voices like broken glass, don't try to help them. Don't try to communicate with them. Don't let them touch you. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and don't look back. Because once they've chosen you, once they've marked you as prey, the only thing that might save you is the dawn, and dawn is still many hours away.